The polished marble floors of Aria, a restaurant so exclusive it didn't have a sign, reflected the city lights like a captured constellation. Here, fortunes were made and dismantled over plates of food that were more architecture than sustenance. In this hushed cathedral of wealth, Clara Hayes was a phantom in a starched black apron. At 28, she moved with an economy of motion that bordered on invisibility, her face a carefully constructed mask of pleasant neutrality. The $47 in crumpled bills in her pocket felt like an anchor, the only thing tethering her to the ground. Tonight, the anchor was dragging. A double shift, a looming rent payment, and the ghost of a life she'd torched 4 years ago were weighing on her. That life had belonged to Dr. Clara Hayes, a name once spoken with a reverence usually reserved for Nobel laureates in the rarefied world of metabolic biochemistry. Now she was just Clara, the waitress who knew precisely when to refill a water glass without being asked. The anonymity was her sanctuary and her prison. At 8 p.m., the hushed atmosphere of Aria rippled. Serafina Vance arrived, not with a grand entrance, but with the quiet, gravitational pull of immense wealth. She was preceded by a man named Marcus, whose suit was tailored to conceal both a firearm and the physique of a heavyweight boxer. Serafina was ethereally beautiful, with pale skin, eyes the color of twilight, and a fragility that seemed at odds with the Vance name. Her father, Elias Vance, was a titan of industry, a man who had clawed his way from the Rust Belt to build a global logistics empire. He was a shark, and Serafina was his precious porcelain doll. Clara knew the routine. The corner table number 12 always kept empty until Serafina's arrival. 1 bottle of still mineral water, imported from a specific Norwegian glacier. A single, perfectly ripe pear, sliced thin. Serafina had a rare, complex metabolic disorder, a fact the society pages whispered about, and her father's army of doctors managed with military precision. Clara knew this because she noticed things. She noticed the discreet medical alert bracelet on Serafina's wrist. She noticed the almost imperceptible tremor in her hand as she reached for her water. And she noticed the sleek, silver auto-injector pen Marcus would place on the table, a silent, gleaming sentinel. Clara had seen that pen before. Not one exactly like it, but its ancestor, its prototype, in a life she no longer claimed. The sight of it sent a familiar, phantom limb ache through her soul. Tonight, something was wrong. Serafina looked paler than usual, a translucent quality to her skin. Marcus seemed wound tighter, his eyes scanning the room with more than his usual professional vigilance. He kept glancing at the pen. "Just the water and a pear tonight, Miss Vance?" Clara asked, her voice the practiced, soothing murmur of the service industry. Serafina looked up, and for a fleeting moment her weary eyes met Clara's. There was a flicker of genuine distress in their depths. "Yes, thank you, Clara." And, "Could you ask the chef if the amuse-bouche tonight contains any angelica root?" The question was so specific, so arcane, it hung in the air. Marcus shot Serafina a warning look. Clara's mind, the part she kept locked away, the part that held doctorates and dissertations, instantly sparked. Angelica sinensis, phytoestrogenic properties, known to interfere with CYP3A4 enzyme pathways. "Of course, Miss Vance. I'll check immediately." Clara turned, her heart starting a low, frantic drumbeat against her ribs. She took 2 steps towards the kitchen. Then she heard the sound that would shatter the gilded piece of Aria forever. It wasn't a scream. It was a soft, sharp gasp, like a string being pulled too tight and snapping. She spun around. Serafina Vance was frozen in her chair, Her fork had clattered to her plate. Her eyes were wide, fixed on a point in the middle distance, a terrifying vacancy in her stare. The silver pen lay untouched. "Sarah," Marcus said, his voice sharp with alarm, already moving towards her. "No," Serafina whispered, a thread of a sound. Her left hand rose, claw-like, to her own throat. Then her body convulsed. It was a silent, horrifying spasm, her back arching with unnatural force. She pitched forward, her head striking the heavy oak table with a sickening, hollow crack before she slid bonelessly to the floor. Pandemonium erupted. A woman at a nearby table shrieked. Men in $1,000 suits leaped to their feet, chairs scraping violently against the marble. "Call 911!" the maître d' shouted, fumbling with his phone. Marcus was already on his radio, his voice a controlled roar. "Code Blue! Code Blue! Sentinel protocol failure at Aria, requesting immediate medical evac." He knelt beside Serafina. She was unconscious, her breathing a series of shallow, ragged hitches. A deathly bluish pallor was creeping across her lips. "Serafina, can you hear me? Damn it!" He looked up, his eyes wild with a terror that no amount of security training could conceal. He was a protector, not a physician. For 1 second, 2, Clara stood paralyzed. The walls she had meticulously built around her past, the fortress of anonymity, the years of self-imposed exile, it all vaporized in a flash of heat and memory. The waitress vanished. Dr. Hayes was back in the room. "Move," she snapped. The voice that emerged was not her own soft, deferential tone. It was clipped, resonant with an authority that had once commanded research labs and lecture halls. It was so forceful that Marcus, the mountain of a man, actually flinched and looked up at her. She dropped to her knees beside him, shoving his bulk aside with surprising strength. It's a metabolic cascade. Her enzyme is denaturing. It's not her heart, it's cellular. "Who the hell are you?" Marcus snarled, reaching to push her away. "The only person in this building who knows what's happening," Clara shot back, her fingers already pressing against the delicate skin of Serafina's neck, searching for the carotid artery. The pulse was a frantic, thready whisper. "The pen, is it a custom formulation of L-arginine succinate?" Marcus stared at her, dumbfounded. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I helped develop the base compound," Clara said, her mind racing, processing variables at a speed she hadn't accessed in years. She looked at Serafina's face. The pupils were beginning to dilate unevenly. Brain anoxia. They didn't have minutes, they had seconds. "The ambulance is 12 minutes out in this traffic," the maître d' yelled. "She doesn't have 12 minutes," Clara muttered. "She has less than 2. Her eyes darted around the restaurant, not seeing the luxury, but scanning for resources. The bar, the kitchen, the decorative plants. Her gaze locked onto a large, potted fern near the window, its fronds a deep, glossy green. Polypodium glycerizer, high concentrations of osledin and glycyrrhizin. A long shot, a desperate, insane long shot. "What are you doing?" Marcus demanded, his hand hovering near her. Clara ignored him, barking orders at the nearest busboy, a terrified teenager named Leo. "Leo, get me the largest metal mixing bowl you can find. A bottle of distilled water from the bar, not mineral, distilled, and the box of fleur de sel from the kitchen. Now." "What?" Leo stammered. "Move!" Clara's voice cracked like a whip. Leo, galvanized by the sheer command in her tone, bolted for the kitchen. "If you harm her, I will put you on the ground," Marcus warned, his voice a low growl. "Then you'll be arresting me for saving her life," Clara retorted, not looking at him. She ripped a handful of fronds from the decorative fern, her mind a whirlwind of calculations. Crude extraction. Need a solvent. Alcohol. The bar. Get me a bottle of their highest proof vodka, unflavored. Marcus was frozen, caught between his duty to protect and the terrifying, undeniable competence of the woman in front of him. He relayed the order into his radio. Leo skidded back, a huge stainless steel bowl in his hands, followed by a bartender with the water and a chef with a small wooden box of salt. Here. Clara's hands moved with a surgeon's precision. She poured a measured amount of water into the bowl, then added a precise quantity of salt, her eyes estimating the grams. She ripped the fern fronds into pieces, dropping them into the bowl, and then grabbed the vodka from the bartender, adding a splash. She began crushing the leaves against the side of the bowl with the back of a heavy serving spoon, her knuckles white. "What in God's name is that?" the maitre d' whispered, horrified. "A non-Newtonian fluid suspension to create an osmotic stabilizer," Clara breathed, her focus absolute. "The salt and water create a hypertonic saline solution to temporarily restore cell function, and the glycyrrhizin from the fern should, in theory, act as a binding agent to slow the enzyme degradation." It was a theory she had scribbled on a whiteboard at 3 a.m. 4 years ago, a theoretical emergency countermeasure that had never made it past the simulation stage. The theory that her old boss, Dr. Alistair Finch, had called elegant but impractical fantasy. She was about to test that fantasy on the daughter of Elias Vance on the floor of a 3 Michelin-star restaurant. For 10, 15, 20 agonizing seconds, she worked, creating a thick, green, pungent slurry. Serafina's breathing grew shallower. A monitor on Marcus's wrist, wirelessly linked to Serafina's bracelet, began to emit a single, high-pitched, continuous tone. "She's flatlining," Marcus yelled. "Let her go. The medics—" "Shut up and hold her head," Clara commanded, straining the liquid through a linen napkin into a water glass. "Tilt her chin back. Open her mouth. Don't let her aspirate." Wide-eyed, terrified, but seeing no other option, Marcus cradled his charge's head. Clara pinched Serafina's nose and poured a small, steady stream of the crude, green liquid into her mouth, massaging her throat to force a swallow reflex. For a terrible, endless moment. Nothing happened. The single, piercing tone from the monitor continued its vigil. The room was utterly silent, save for the distant wail of approaching sirens. "It's not working," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking with despair. "Wait," Clara breathed, her eyes fixed on Serafina's chest. "Wait." Suddenly, Serafina's body gave a massive, convulsive shudder. A deep, ragged gasp tore from her lungs, a sound that was half drown, half rebirth. The horrifying blue tint receded from her lips, replaced by a surge of pink. The high-pitched tone from the monitor stopped, replaced by the slow, steady beep of a recovering heartbeat. Serafina's eyelids fluttered. Her breathing, though still labored, deepened into a regular rhythm. The collective breath of everyone in Aria was released in a single, unified sigh. Clara fell back on her heels, the makeshift mortar and pestle clattering to the floor. Her entire body was shaking, not with fear, but with the violent, purging surge of 4 years of suppressed adrenaline and grief. She looked at what she had done. Marcus was staring at the monitor on his wrist, then at Clara, his face a mask of disbelief. He spoke into his mic, his voice hoarse. "Vitals are stabilizing. I don't know. The waitress, she did something." The sirens screamed outside. A team of paramedics burst through the doors, a whirlwind of equipment and brisk efficiency. "What do we have?" the lead paramedic shouted. "Unresponsive female, 22, known metabolic condition," Marcus reported, his professional demeanor snapping back into place. "Experienced a full cascade event." The paramedics swarmed the scene, pushing Clara aside. "Ma'am, you need to step back. Give us room." Clara stumbled backward, her legs feeling like water. She melted into the throng of stunned onlookers. The maitre d' rushed to her side. "Clara, my God, how did you—" She just shook her head, backing away toward the kitchen, the icy grip of terror returning. She hadn't just performed an unlicensed, experimental, and wildly dangerous medical procedure in public. She had just announced to the world, or at least to the very powerful world of Elias Vance, that Dr. Clara Hayes was no longer dead. She hadn't just saved Serafina Vance. She had just annihilated her own carefully constructed oblivion. As the paramedics loaded Serafina onto a gurney, her eyes fluttered open again. They bypassed her bodyguard, bypassed the medical team. They scanned the room, hazy and unfocused, until they locked onto Clara, who was trembling by the swinging doors to the kitchen. Serafina's lips formed a single, silent word. "How?" Clara turned and fled. She ripped off her apron, tossed it on a counter, and was out the service entrance and gone into the wet, anonymous labyrinth of the city streets before the ambulance doors had even closed. The penthouse floor of the Vance Tower was not a home. It was a command center, suspended in the clouds. From here, Elias Vance could watch his global empire of ships, trucks, and planes crawl across digital maps, a god observing his own meticulously ordered universe. He was a man built of sharp angles and controlled force, with a face carved from granite and eyes that missed nothing. He had not built his empire by accepting mysteries. Opposite him, looking profoundly uncomfortable in a chair that cost more than his car, sat Dr. Alistair Finch. Finch was the head of Biogenics, the boutique Swiss firm that manufactured Serafina's enzyme treatment. He was a man who radiated expensive tailoring and an unshakable professional confidence. For the first time since Elias had known him, that confidence was shaken. "I don't understand, Elias," Finch said, gesturing with manicured hands at a tablet displaying Serafina's vitals from the hospital. "The auto-injector is fail-safe. The L-arginine succinate formulation is stable. A cascade event of this magnitude? It's a statistical impossibility. A 1 in a billion anomaly." "1 in a billion happened last night in my daughter's appetizer," Elias Vance said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He hadn't shouted. He never needed to. His quiet was far more terrifying. "She's stable, Alistair. No thanks to you. No thanks to the millions I pay you. She's alive because a waitress force-fed her a cocktail made from a houseplant and table salt." Finch recoiled as if struck. "That's preposterous. The paramedics' report mentioned an outside intervention. It was reckless, an assault. This waitress, she could have killed her. The saline might have caused a vagal response, a shock to the system. It was a fluke, a lucky guess." He pointed to a sterile evidence bag on the table, which contained the greenish sludge scraped from the water glass. "This is witchcraft, not medicine." "It worked," Elias said, the two words landing like hammer blows. "While your billion-dollar pen sat on the table, this witchcraft saved my daughter's life. My head of security, Marcus, said the waitress knew the exact chemical composition of the enzyme. He said she called it by name." "Impossible," Finch scoffed. "It's a proprietary compound. The formula is known to fewer than a dozen people in the world." "Find her," Elias commanded, turning to a severe-looking woman who stood silently by the window. This was Eleanor Shaw, his chief of staff, a woman who could find a ghost if it had ever paid taxes. "We're already on it, Mr. Vance," Eleanor said, her voice as crisp as a new banknote. "The restaurant manager said her name is Clara Hayes. She's worked there for 8 months. Paid in cash, no social security on file. She fled the scene. NYPD is searching for her as a person of interest." "A person of interest," Elias mused, a dark thought beginning to form. "Someone with intimate knowledge of my daughter's condition, who just happens to be there when this impossible event occurs, performs a miracle, and then vanishes. This wasn't a coincidence, Eleanor. This was a message. Or a threat. Dr. Finch seized on the idea, his relief palpable. Of course. An extortion plot, a disgruntled former employee from one of our labs, perhaps. She causes the problem, provides the cure, and then expects a payout. It's the only explanation that makes sense. A secure line on Elias's desk chirped. Eleanor answered, listened for a moment, and her expression tightened. "Sir, it's the NYPD. They found her. An anonymous tip led them to a small apartment in Queens." "Bring her here," Elias ordered. "There's a complication, sir," Eleanor said, her eyes fixed on the tablet in her hand. "When they ran her fingerprints, they got a flag, a big one. She's not just a waitress. Her prints are on file with the FBI and Interpol." Vance and Finch both stared. "Is she a criminal?" Elias demanded. "No, sir." "Not exactly," Eleanor said, her brow furrowed in confusion. "The file is sealed, flagged for national security review by the Department of Defense. But the original file jacket is from 4 years ago. It's a report on a catastrophic lab fire at the DARPA-funded Penrose Institute in Virginia. The fire destroyed the primary research of a Dr. Aris Thorne on advanced biochemical stabilizers. There were 2 fatalities, Dr. Thorne himself and his lead research assistant. The file lists her as presumed deceased. Her name was Dr. Clara Hayes. A heavy, profound silence descended on the room. Finch's face had gone completely white. He knew the name Aris Thorne. Thorne had been his chief rival, a brilliant, eccentric mind whose work on enzyme synthesis was years ahead of anyone else. Thorne was the one man Finch could never beat. "She was Thorne's protégé," Finch whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. "I thought she died with him." The pieces began to click into place in Elias Vance's mind, forming a picture far more complex and dangerous than a simple extortion plot. "She didn't die," he said, his voice like grinding stone. "She went underground. She became a ghost. The question is why?" He looked at Eleanor. "The hold is temporary. Get her out of police custody. I don't care what it takes, who you have to call. Tell them it's a matter of national security, because it just became one. Don't bring her here. Take her to the safe house. I'll meet you there." The interrogation room was not a room at all, but a soundproofed library in a discreet townhouse on the Upper East Side owned by a Vance Shell Corporation. There was no table, only 2 leather armchairs. Clara sat in one, still in her waitress uniform, smudged with dirt and the green of the fern. She was exhausted, terrified, but the defiant spark in her eyes had not been extinguished. Elias Vance sat opposite her, a statue of controlled fury. Eleanor Shaw stood near the door. "Dr. Hayes," Elias began, the honorific sounding like an accusation. "You've led a very interesting life. And death." Clara flinched. "My name is Clara. According to the United States government, you burned to death 4 years ago," Elias continued, his voice calm and lethal. "You were the star biochemist at Penrose, the right hand of Aris Thorne. You were working on Project Chimera, a revolutionary new enzyme stabilizer. And then, a fire. Your lab, your research, your mentor, all gone. And you with them. But you're not gone, are you? You're serving pears at Aurea, waiting for my daughter to collapse." "It wasn't like that," Clara whispered, her hands clenched in her lap. "I didn't wait for it. I prayed it would never happen." "Then talk," Elias commanded. "Start from the beginning. Why fake your own death?" The story Clara had held captive for 4 years, the truth that had festered like a wound, came pouring out. Project Chimera wasn't just a stabilizer, it was a breakthrough. Aris, Dr. Thorne, had created a synthetic enzyme that could be tailored to correct almost any metabolic deficiency. It was a universal key. My work was to create the delivery system and the fail-safes. We were funded by a DARPA grant, but we had a corporate partner, Biogenics, Dr. Alistair Finch. At the mention of Finch's name, Elias's expression hardened. Finch was jealous of Aris, Clara continued, her voice gaining strength. He saw the military and commercial applications, the billions to be made. Aris only cared about the science, about helping people. 3 months before the fire, I discovered something. A flaw, a vulnerability in the enzyme's protein structure. Under specific conditions, exposure to a certain class of organic alkaloids could cause the enzyme to hyperaccelerate, then denature catastrophically. It wouldn't just stop working, it would actively poison the host's system. Alkaloids? Elias asked, leaning forward. Like what? Like the kind found in trace amounts in plants from the Apiaceae family. Caraway, parsley, angelica root, Clara said, her eyes meeting his. A cold understanding dawned on Elias. The amuse-bouche. Finch's chef at Aria is famous for his use of exotic herbs, Clara said. It was a 1 in a million chance. But I saw Serafina's medical bracelet. I'd seen the press about her condition. When I saw the pen, I knew. It was our design, but corrupted. Cheaper. Simpler. I knew Finch had taken Aris's work after the fire and commercialized it. I knew he had cut corners. What happened at the lab, Clara? Elias asked, his voice softer now. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. I showed my findings to Oris. He was furious. He confronted Finch, told him he was pulling out of the partnership, that he would report the flaw to the DoD. He scheduled a meeting with our DARPA liaison for the next morning. That night, the fire started in our primary server room. It wasn't an accident. The fire suppression system failed. The alarms were disabled. I was working late. Aris pushed me into a fireproof chemical storage closet and sealed the door from the outside. He told me to protect the work. He saved my life, and the fire took his. She was sobbing now, the memory raw and visceral. When I got out, the whole wing was gone. The firefighters found a body in the wreckage, burned beyond recognition. They assumed it was me. My ID was on the desk. I heard the news reports. I heard Alistair Finch give a eulogy for Oris and his tragic young protégé. He called the fire a terrible accident. And then I saw that Biogenics was fast-tracking a new metabolic treatment for FDA approval. A treatment based on a newly acquired enzyme patent. He didn't just let Aris die. He murdered him. He stole our work, buried the flaw, and sold it to the world. He sold it to you. So you ran, Elias concluded. I had no proof, she said, her voice broken. The servers were melted slag. My research was gone. Finch is a powerful, respected man. I was a dead girl. Who would believe me? So I disappeared. I took cash jobs. I stayed off the grid. I just tried to survive. I never wanted to see that silver pen again, as long as I lived. And then your daughter walked into my restaurant. Elias Vance, a man who trusted no one, who believed only in leverage and data, looked at the haunted, brilliant, terrified woman in front of him. And in his gut, a place that had never steered him wrong, he knew she was telling the truth. His entire world, built on the premise that he could control every variable, protect his daughter with a fortress of money and experts, had been a lie. He had been paying his daughter's potential murderer millions of dollars a year. He stood up, walked to the bar, and poured 2 glasses of water. He handed one to Clara. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely hold it. The fern, he said, "and the salt." What was that? A desperate gamble, Clara admitted. Aris and I had theorized an emergency countermeasure. The hypertonic saline solution was meant to temporarily stabilize the osmotic pressure in her cells. The fern, Polypodium glycyrrhiza, contains a natural compound that we believed could act as a temporary binding agent for the denaturing protein. It was never tested. It was just a conversation, a theory on a whiteboard. She looked at her hands. Until last night. The room was silent. Elias Vance's mind was processing, calculating, realigning his entire worldview. The waitress wasn't an extortionist. She was a survivor. She was a witness, and she was the only one who held the key. He looked at Eleanor Shaw. His voice was quiet, but it vibrated with a cold, compressed fury that was more potent than any explosion. "Eleanor, Dr. Hayes is now under my personal protection. Move her to the penthouse. Triple the security. She's not to be questioned by anyone. She's not a person of interest. She's our primary asset." He turned back to Clara. "Finch thinks this is over. He thinks he's dealt with a minor PR issue. He has no idea what's coming." He walked over to her, and for the first time, she saw past the titan of industry to the terrified father beneath. "My daughter is alive, but she's not out of the woods. The doctors are baffled. They can't stabilize her enzyme levels. That flaw you talked about, it's a ticking bomb. I paid Alistair Finch a fortune for a cure. What he gave me was a weapon with my daughter's name on it." He locked his gaze on hers. "I don't want your gratitude, Dr. Hayes. I don't want your apology for running. I want your brain. I want you to work with my people. I want you to find the proof you lost in that fire. Find me one thread, one piece of data that proves what Finch did. And when you find it, you and I are going to burn Alistair Finch's world to the ground." For 2 days, the penthouse at Vance Tower became a war room. The priceless impressionist paintings were obscured by whiteboards, covered in chemical equations and data flow charts. A team of the world's best data recovery specialists, men and women who normally worked for 3-letter government agencies, were flown in on a private jet and now huddled over humming banks of servers. They were Elias Vance's private army of digital ghosts, and Clara was their general. "He was thorough," Clara muttered, staring at a schematic of the Penrose Institute server architecture. "He didn't just let it burn, he used a thermite charge. It melted the central drives into a solid block of silicon and metal. There were off-site backups," said a man named Kovich, the team lead, who looked more like a hacker than a forensic analyst. "Triple redundancy. One in a bunker in West Virginia, controlled by the DoD. Which Finch, as the corporate partner, would have had sealed as part of the investigation into the accident," Clara countered, her mind sharp and clear for the first time in years, fueled by coffee and a righteous fury. He would have presented himself as the sole inheritor of the project's intellectual property. He would have controlled the narrative. The data in that bunker is probably his corrupted version of our work. "He's arrogant," Eleanor Shaw observed from the corner, where she was coordinating a global investigation into Finch's finances. "He believes his own story." "It's more than arrogance," Clara said, a new thought taking shape. Aris was paranoid about intellectual property theft. He was old school. He didn't trust the cloud. She walked to a whiteboard, her hands moving with renewed purpose. "He kept a private, air-gapped server in the lab. A Faraday cage. It wouldn't have been connected to the main network. The fire department schematics. Where are they?" Kovich projected the building's blueprints onto a large screen. Clara pointed to a small, windowless room in the corner of the lab. "There. The chemical storage closet. The one he pushed me into." It was shielded. If anything survived, it would be in there. The site was bulldozed 6 months after the fire, Eleanor said, her voice flat. Biogenex bought the land and built a new distribution center on top of it. A wave of despair washed over Clara. Then it's gone. Maybe not, Elias Vance said, entering the room. He hadn't slept. He held a thick, leather-bound journal. I had my people pull every piece of evidence from the original fire investigation. Most of it was useless. But they found this in the evidence locker, logged as Dr. Thorne's personal effects. He handed the journal to Clara. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It was Aris's handwriting, a dense, looping script she knew as well as her own. It was his research journal. She flipped through the pages, a cascade of memories and equations washing over her, and then she found it. The last entry, dated the day of the fire. Confronted AF today about the alkaloid vulnerability. He was dismissive, arrogant. I fear he sees only the dollar signs. I'm terminating the partnership. Meeting with DOD in the AM. I've encrypted the Chimera master file and transferred the only key to the offline drive. He will not steal this. He will not corrupt it. For security, I've coded the decryption key into a sequence he would never understand. My little joke. It's hidden in plain sight, in the one place beauty trumps logic. Clara's heart hammered in her chest. A sequence, hidden in plain sight. She looked at Kovich. We need to get into that DOD bunker. We need the encrypted file. While Eleanor made the calls, pulling strings that reached the highest levels of the Pentagon, Clara paced, the journal clutched in her hands. The one place beauty trumps logic. What did Aris mean? He was a man of science, but he had passions. He loved vintage motorcycles. He was a terrible but enthusiastic painter. And he loved music. Classical music. Specifically, the complex mathematical genius of Bach. My God, she whispered. Kovich, can you pull up the sheet music for Bach's Goldberg variations? Kovich looked at her, bewildered, but did as he was told. A complex series of notes filled the screen. Variation 13, Clara said, her voice trembling with dawning realization. Aris always said it was the most perfectly structured piece of music ever composed. He called it God's algorithm. The key, it's not a word, it's the notes. An hour later, they had it. A secure connection to the DOD bunker was established. They located the encrypted master file, a massive block of seemingly random data. Clara, reading from the sheet music, called out the sequence of notes, which Kovich translated into alphanumeric code. CAGGFEEFDEC. He hit enter. A progress bar appeared on the screen. It crawled to 99% and hung there. Come on, Aris, Clara breathed. Decryption complete. The file opened. It was everything, their entire project. The raw data, the molecular diagrams, the protein folding simulations. And there, in a subfolder marked Vulnerabilities, was Clara's original report on the alkaloid flaw, complete with a time-stamped video of a simulation showing the catastrophic cascade effect. But there was something else, a file she'd never seen before. It was labeled Finch Comms. It was a log of every email and text message Aris had secretly backed up from Finch's communications regarding the project. She clicked it open. The room went silent as they read. Finch wasn't just dismissive of the flaw, he was actively discussing it with his head of development. Thorne is a purist fool, one email from Finch read. This flaw he's so worried about has a trigger probability of less than 0.001%. To re-engineer the protein structure would cost 80 million and set us back 2 years. We bury it. We modify the formulation slightly, patent it under our own name, and push for market. The profits are too vast to let his academic caution get in the way. It was the smoking gun. Cold, calculated corporate malfeasance. He knew. He knew all along. He hadn't created the flaw, but he had deliberately and knowingly covered it up for profit. The fire wasn't just to steal the research, it was to silence the only two people who knew the truth. The secure line buzzed. Eleanor answered. "Yes, Mr. Vance. I see. We have it. We're on our way." She hung up, her face grim. "It's Serafina. She's conscious. She's asking for you, Clara." The ride back to the hospital was a blur. The data file, the proof that could destroy Alistair Finch, was on a hardened drive in Clara's bag. This time she was escorted through a private entrance, up a dedicated elevator, and into Serafina's medical suite. Elias Vance stood by the window, looking out over the city. He looked 10 years older than he had 2 days ago. Serafina was sitting up in bed, pale but lucid. The web of monitors surrounding her beeped with a steady, reassuring rhythm. When she saw Clara, a flicker of recognition, of gratitude, crossed her face. "The waitress?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "My name is Clara," Clara said softly, approaching the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been run over by one of my father's trucks," Serafina said, a weak smile touching her lips. "And then rescued by a ghost." She looked from Clara to her father. "He told me. About who you are. About the fire." Her gaze returned to Clara, sharp and intelligent. "He told me you found a flaw in the enzyme. But there's something else, isn't there? I can see it in your eyes. What did you find?" Clara hesitated, looking at Elias. This wasn't a diagnosis. It was a verdict. "Tell her," Elias said, his voice heavy. Clara took a deep breath. "Serafina, the flaw wasn't just an accident of science. It wasn't an unknown. Dr. Finch knew about it before he ever sold the treatment to your father. He knew it was vulnerable. He knew it could fail. He covered it up because fixing it would have been too expensive." The blood drained from Serafina's face. She stared at her own hands, at the IV line pumping the life-saving, yet potentially lethal, enzyme into her veins. "So, my entire life since I got this treatment, this constant vigilance, this fear, it wasn't because my condition was so fragile. It was because the cure was defective." "He didn't just sell me a defective product," Elias growled, slamming his fist softly against the window pane. "He played Russian roulette with my daughter's life to protect his profit margins. Every day for 4 years, he let you live with a ticking bomb inside you, and he cashed my checks." The sheer, cold-blooded cynicism of it was staggering. Finch hadn't murdered Serafina, but he had accepted the risk of her death as a cost. The silence in the 80th floor boardroom was a physical entity, a pressurized void that seemed to suck the sound from the city below. It was a silence curated by wealth, a quietude that cost millions in soundproofing and elevation. Dr. Alistair Finch, flanked by 2 lawyers who looked like bespoke predators, walked into that silence, his confidence a tangible aura. He saw Elias Vance, a monolith of contained rage at the head of a granite table. He saw Eleanor Shaw, a stiletto in human form. And then he saw her. For a fractional, unmeasurable moment, the universe tilted on its axis. The meticulously constructed reality in Alistair Finch's mind, a world in which he was the victor, the inheritor, the genius, shattered into a million glittering shards of impossibility. The face was older, etched with a weariness he'd never seen. But the eyes were the same. They were Oris Thorne's eyes in a way. The same terrifying, analytical intelligence. He was looking at a ghost. His recovery was a marvel of corporate conditioning. The shock was instantly suppressed, paved over with a sneer. "Dr. Hayes," he said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "To what do we owe this resurrection? Have you finally come to answer for your part in Dr. Thorne's tragic death?" "I always suspected your recklessness was the cause of that fire." Elias Vance did not move. He didn't have to. His stillness was more menacing than any gesture. "Sit down, Alistair." The words were not a request. They were a tectonic shift in the room's power dynamic. Finch sat, a puppet whose strings had been cut and clumsily reattached. His lawyers began their pre-rehearsed objections, a symphony of legal jargon that died in their throats as Eleanor Shaw simply raised a hand. "You called my research a fantasy, Alistair." Clara's voice was low, not the deferential whisper of a waitress, but the focused, resonant tone of a scientist presenting her thesis. It echoed with 4 years of suppressed truth. "You said my report on the alkaloid vulnerability was academic hysteria." "And I was right," Finch shot back, finding his footing in the familiar terrain of intellectual condescension. "Your data was incomplete. Your conclusions alarmist. Aris was a brilliant theorist, but he lacked practical application. He would have chased perfection into bankruptcy. I made his work viable." "You made it a weapon," Elias Vance's voice cut in, cold and sharp as splintered ice. "You sold me a beautifully packaged silver-plated landmine, and you put it in my daughter's bloodstream." Clara nodded to Eleanor. The wall-sized screen behind Elias, previously displaying a serene image of a Japanese garden, flickered to life. It showed not a simulation, but a photograph. A simple, worn leather journal, open to a page of dense, looping script. "Aris Thorne's last entry," Clara said, her voice softening with a grief that was still raw. "He wrote it the day you murdered him." Finch flinched as if struck. "That is a slanderous lie." "Confronted AF today about the alkaloid vulnerability," Clara read, her voice filling the room, a séance summoning a righteous ghost. He was dismissive, arrogant. "I fear he sees only the dollar signs. I'm terminating the partnership. He will not steal this. He will not corrupt it." She looked up from the tablet in her hands, her eyes locking onto Finch's. "He also wrote about your jealousy, Alistair. About how you could never stand that his mind went places yours couldn't follow. He called you a brilliant accountant of science, but a pauper of invention. The insult, so specific, so Aris, landed with surgical precision. A flicker of genuine, unadulterated rage crossed Finch's face. "That journal proves nothing," he spat. "The ramblings of a stressed, paranoid man." "Then let's move on to your own ramblings," Eleanor said crisply. The screen changed. It was Finch's email. "This flaw he's so worried about has a trigger probability of less than 0.01%. To re-engineer would cost 80 million. We bury it." The air left Finch's lungs. This was not a fabrication. This was his soul, digitized and damned. He stared at the screen, at the cold calculus of his own greed, and for the first time, the mask of the urbane scientist melted away, revealing the terrified, cornered bookkeeper beneath. "The servers," he stammered, his eyes darting to Clara. They were slag. Melted. "Aris Thorne was a genius," Clara said, standing now, no longer a ghost, but an avenging angel in a borrowed suit. "But more than that, he was a good man. He believed science was a sacred trust, a trust you violated. He kept a backup, Alistair, an air-gapped, shielded, private server. He hid it in the one place he knew would survive the fire. The place he saved my life, and he left me the key, woven into the fabric of something you never took the time to appreciate. Beauty." Her words hung in the air, an epitaph for his shriveled imagination. "You!" he finally shrieked, the sound raw and ugly. He surged to his feet, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You were an assistant, a glorified note-taker. Thorne was a dinosaur, clinging to his precious ethics while the world moved on. I took his abstract scribbles, and I created a multi-billion-dollar therapy that has saved lives." "How many?" Elias Vance's roar was the sound of a dam breaking. He rose to his full, imposing height, his hands flat on the table, and the sheer force of his presence seemed to bend the light in the room. "How many lives, Alistair? How many of the 216 people you sold this poison to have suffered unexplained seizures? How many have died from complications their doctors couldn't diagnose? We've already found 17, Alistair. 17 families who buried a loved one because you wanted to save $80 million. My daughter was nearly the 18th. You didn't save lives. You monetized a calculated risk and called it a cure." The boardroom doors swung open. It was not the FBI, not yet. It was a team from Vance's own financial division, led by a man with the cheerful demeanor of an undertaker. He placed a stack of documents in front of Finch's lawyers. "That," Elias said, his voice dropping back to a lethal calm, "is a preliminary injunction filed in the Cayman Islands 10 minutes ago, freezing all Biogenex assets and all of your personal accounts, pending the outcome of the largest corporate malfeasance lawsuit in pharmaceutical history. We found the shell corporations, Alistair. We found the offshore accounts where you hid the profits from your viable product. You are not just a murderer. You are a bankrupt one." The collapse was total. Finch sank into his chair, a hollowed-out man. His lawyer was pale, whispering frantically into his phone. The fight was over. He was a king one moment, a pauper the next. Then the FBI agents entered. The cuffs, the formal words of the arrest. It was all an anticlimax. As they led him away, his eyes, wild with hatred, found Clara's one last time. "You think you've won?" he hissed, his voice a venomous rasp. "You think this titan gives a damn about you? He's not your savior. He's your new owner. He'll put your name on a plaque and your soul in a gilded cage. You haven't escaped. You've just traded prisons." Then he was gone, and the silence that rushed back in was heavier, more complex than before. It was the sound of an ending. Clara felt the strength drain from her legs. She gripped the back of a chair, the adrenaline of the confrontation leaving a nauseating void in its wake. It was done. Justice, or a version of it, had been served. But the hollowness in her chest felt less like victory and more like an echo. Elias walked to the window, his back to her. For a long time, he just stared at the city he owned. "He was wrong about one thing," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "I don't own you. I owe you. A debt so profound it has no monetary value." "We're even," she whispered, the words feeling thin and inadequate. "You gave me my name back." "A name isn't a life," he countered, turning to face her. The tycoon was gone. In his place was a father, stripped bare and terrified. "Serafina is stable, but the clock is ticking. Every bite of food she takes is a game of chance. Finch's enzyme is still in her system, a ghost in her machine." He took a step closer, his gaze intense, pleading. "You and Thorne, the real work, Project Chimera. Can it be done? Can you build it from the ashes?" The question was a weight, a responsibility so immense it threatened to crush her. For 4 years, her only goal had been to remain invisible. Now, he was asking her to create a miracle. "It's possible," she heard herself say. The scientist in her, long dormant, was stirring. "The data from Aris's server is intact, but it would take a dedicated lab, a team, resources beyond—" "Done," he said. The single word, a covenant. I am liquidating my majority stake in Vance Logistics. The proceeds will fund a new foundation, independent, unshackled, the Thorne Hayes Institute for Metabolic Science. He saw the flicker of shock in her eyes. Your name on the door, Clara. Your lab. Your team. Your vision. No board of directors asking about profit margins. No shareholders to appease. Just the science. Pure, unadulterated. I don't want your gratitude. I want a cure. Finish the work that monster tried to bury. Save my daughter. For good. The days that followed were a disorienting blur of gilded captivity. Clara lived in a penthouse suite that felt more like a luxurious observation deck than a home. She was no longer a waitress, but she wasn't yet Dr. Hayes. She was an asset, a key, a ghost in transition. The tailored clothes Eleanor provided felt like a costume. The gourmet food tasted like ash. At night, she'd wake up smelling smoke, the phantom heat of the fire on her skin, Aris's last words echoing in the vast, empty rooms. Protect the work. On the third day, she went to the hospital, not as an asset, but as Clara. She found Serafina staring out the window, a book of poetry lying unread in her lap. The room was filled with flowers whose scent couldn't mask the sterile tang of antiseptic. I hate lilies, Serafina said without turning. They smell like funerals. Clara stood by the door. I can have them taken away. Serafina finally turned. Her face was pale, but her eyes, those twilight eyes, were unnervingly clear. He told me everything, she said, about who you were, about Finch, about the fact that my life has been a lie, held together by a faulty molecule. She gestured to the IV stand beside her, the slow, steady drip, a constant reminder of her fragility. This isn't a cure, it's a leash. We're going to fix it, Clara said, the words feeling both like a promise and a prayer. Are we? Serafina's gaze was sharp, cutting through the platitudes. Or are you? My father buys things, Dr. Hayes. He buys companies. He buys loyalty. He buys solutions. Now he's bought you, a brilliant scientist, to fix his broken daughter. Does it ever bother you that you're just another acquisition? Finch's final words echoed in Clara's mind. He's your new owner. Clara walked to the bed and sat in the visitor's chair. 4 years ago, she began, her voice quiet. I lost everything. My mentor, my research, my name. I ran and I hid. I became a ghost because I was terrified. I spent every day just trying to survive, telling myself it was a choice, that anonymity was a form of freedom. It wasn't. It was a prison I built for myself. Your father. He didn't buy me, Serafina. He opened the door to my cell. What I do now, whether I walk out or stay cowering inside, that's up to me. She looked at the young woman in the bed. You've been in a prison, too. One made of sterile rooms and careful diets and constant fear. The door is opening for you, too. Tears welled in Serafina's eyes. I'm scared, she whispered. I don't know who I am without the illness, the fragile Serafina Vance. It's been my entire identity. Then we'll have to find out, Clara said. Together. That conversation was the crucible. It burned away the last of the fear and forged a new, unshakable resolve. The Thorne Hayes Institute rose from the ground with the impossible speed of immense wealth, a cathedral of glass and steel dedicated to a single purpose. Clara was relentless. She worked 18-hour days, fueled by coffee and a 4-year-old rage. She wasn't just rebuilding Aris's work. She was resurrecting him, his principles, his genius. On the whiteboards covered in complex equations, she could almost feel his presence, guiding her hand, challenging her assumptions. She handpicked her team, not just for their resumes, but for their hunger. They were the brilliant outsiders, the researchers who, like her, didn't fit into the corporate mold. They argued, they fought, they broke through walls of theory with sheer, collaborative force. Elias Vance was a constant, silent presence. He never interfered, never questioned a budget, but he would stand for hours behind the observation glass, watching them work, a silent vigil for his daughter's future. Serafina became a part of the process. She'd visit the lab, her IV pole rolling beside her, and ask questions, not about timetables, but about the science itself. She learned the names of the amino acids, the intricacies of protein folding. She was taking ownership of her own biology, dismantling her fear one piece of knowledge at a time. She and Clara formed an unlikely, unspoken bond, two survivors mapping the path to their own liberation. 9 months after the confrontation in the boardroom, the day came. They called it Chimera 7. It was the stable, perfected enzyme, elegant, resilient, and true to Aris's original vision. The procedure was quiet, clinical, yet fraught with a tension that felt sacred. Serafina lay in a private room at the Institute, not a hospital. Elias stood in one corner, looking older, smaller, his hands clenched at his sides. Clara stood by the monitors, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The new enzyme, clear as water, began its slow drip into Serafina's arm. They watched the monitors, the cascading numbers and waveforms that told the story of her body's inner world. An hour passed, then 2. The flawed enzyme was flushed out, the new one taking its place. The numbers held steady. Her vital signs, for the first time in her life, were not just stable. They were perfect. Serafina opened her eyes. She looked at her father, then at Clara. A single tear traced a path down her temple. "It's quiet," she whispered. "What is?" Elias asked, his voice thick. "The fear," she said. "It's gone." 3 months later, Clara stood on that same observation deck, looking down at the lab. It was late. The hum of the servers was a comforting lullaby. The work was not over. It was just beginning. They were synthesizing Chimera 7 for the 216 other patients, a global lifeline funded entirely by the Foundation. Legal teams were helping the families of the 17 victims Finch's negligence had killed. The name Biogenics had been wiped from the stock exchange, a toxic asset dissolved into history. The door opened behind her. It was Serafina. She wore jeans, a worn band t-shirt, and a pair of scuffed boots. She carried a cardboard box. "I brought you dinner," she said, placing the box on a console. The smell of garlic and oregano filled the air. "Pizza." "Anchovies?" Clara asked with a smile. "And extra jalapenos," Serafina grinned. "I'm making up for lost time." They ate in a comfortable silence, their shoulders touching, watching the city lights ignite against the darkening sky. "I declared my major today," Serafina said, wiping her mouth with a napkin. "Biochemistry." Clara raised an eyebrow. "I thought it was going to be poetry." "That's my minor," she said. "I figured out something, watching you work. Science tells you how the world works. Poetry tells you why it matters. You need both." She grew serious for a moment. "My father. He's finally learning that. He's funding arts programs now. Libraries in underprivileged neighborhoods. He says there's no point in saving a life if you don't give that person a world worth living in." "He's a good man," Clara said, and was surprised to find she meant it. "He's trying to be," Serafina corrected gently. "We all are." She stood and stretched, a gesture of casual, unthinking freedom that still made Clara's heart ache with joy. "I have to go. Midterms are a killer. Thank you for dinner." She gave Clara a quick, warm hug. "And you know, for everything else. Any time, Sarah." Clara watched her go, a young woman walking into her own life, defined not by a rare disease or a famous name, but by her own choices, right down to the toppings on her pizza. She turned back to the window, looking at her own reflection, superimposed over the gleaming laboratory below. For years, she had seen a ghost in the mirror, a haunted woman running from a past she couldn't outrun. Tonight, she saw someone else. She saw the quiet waitress who learned to see the person behind the order. She saw the fierce scientist who had reclaimed her voice. They weren't two different people. They were two halves of a whole. Finch's curse had been a lie. This wasn't a cage. It was a crucible. She hadn't just finished Aris's work. She had transcended it, infused it with an empathy born of pain and exile. A cure, she now understood, was more than a corrected molecule. It was the restoration of possibility. It was the quiet moment a young woman could choose her own future. It was the freedom to build, not just a career, but a life. And in the silent, humming heart of the Institute, under the watchful gaze of the city lights, Dr. Clara Hayes was finally, truly home.